In this lesson, we will learn how to style a navigation menu of links. In front of you is an example page that we created in an earlier lesson, and in this lesson, we're going to add a navigation menu in the header. So let's get started by hopping over to our text editor, and we know from an earlier lesson that the HTML to create a navigation menu begins with an element named nav. Within the nav element, we'll create an unordered list, and then obviously within the unordered list, we'll create one list item for each link. Within the list item, we'll add an anchor or a link element, and then let's copy and paste this several times. Okay, so we'll have one link that reads home, another that reads about, portfolio, and contact us. So if we save and refresh, we can see that our header now has a series of links, and our goal for this lesson is to style these links so that they look like a well-designed menu bar. Our first two tasks will be to A, remove the bullets from each list item, and B, get the links to sit side by side one another, all on one horizontal line, instead of stacking one per line. So we'll begin by removing the bullets. Let's add a class to this nav element so that it's easy to target with our CSS. Site nav. Now, in our CSS, let's create a new section. We'll use a CSS comment, site navigation. To create a comment in CSS, you include a / and then an asterisk. To close the comment, you include an asterisk and a / End site navigation. So now we can include our CSS between these two lines, and we will stay very organized. So we'll say site nav, target the list items, and we want their list style to be none. So this will remove the bullets. So our next step is to get the links to sit side by side one another. We can use the float property to achieve this. So while we're still targeting the list items, we'll add a new declaration, float, and we'll float all of the all of the list items to the left. And we learned in an earlier lesson that when you float a series of elements, you need to clear the floats. Because currently, if all of these list items are floated, this parent element of UL has no idea that it has any content within it. So for layout purposes, we really need to clear our floats. And we created a utility class named group in an earlier lesson that we can reuse. So by adding this class, this element will now automatically clear the floats of its children. So if we save and refresh, we can see that all of the links now sit on one line. Next, we can see that there's a bit of space on the left side of the navigation. So to remove that, we need to target the unordered list element, because by default, it has padding and perhaps margin in certain browsers. So we go into the site nav, and then we target the unordered list element, and we just want to remove any default padding and margin that the browser might be trying to apply. Much better. Next, let's add a bit of space between the slogan and our navigation. So to do that, in our CSS, we will target the nav element that has a class of site nav, and we'll give it a bit of top margin. Margin top, 20 pixels. Much better. Now let's focus on styling the links themselves. So we will begin by removing their underline. To do that, we'll jump inside the site nav element and then target the A or the anchor element. Text decoration, none. Excellent. Now let's customize the color of the links. Let's override the default blue link color. So I like this green that we're using for the other header text. While we're targeting the A or the link element in our CSS, we'll add a new property of color, and then we'll paste in that hexadecimal color code. So we can see the links are now green. Next, let's add spacing around each link and also give them a subtle border so that they begin to look like buttons that you're encouraged to tap or click. So while we are targeting the link elements, we will add a property of padding, 10 pixels vertical and 20 pixels horizontal, and let's also give them a border. Let's make their border the same color as this sidebar background and these subtle borders that we already see in the layout. Border, 3 pixels solid, and then the subtle green color. So if we save and refresh, we can see a few things. The first thing that we see is that the links themselves did receive the vertical padding. So we can see that they do have 10 pixels of padding on the top and 10 pixels of padding on the bottom. However, the content above and below the links is not aware of this padding. So for example, if I set this to 40 pixels vertical padding, we can see that the links are overlapping the content surrounding them. And that's because by default, link elements, or A elements, are inline elements instead of block level elements. So all this means is that by default, the browser has this property, display inline, associated with an A element. We want to override that default behavior. We want a link to be a block level element. So once the element is a block level element, it can receive vertical padding, and the content around it will be aware of that padding. So let's set this back to a reasonable value of 10. And next, let's add horizontal space between each link. So to do that, we'll target the list items, and we'll add a bit of margin right to each list item, 5 pixels. Next, I think it would look neat if the link sat directly on this borderline between the header and the body content. So let's remove that spacing on the header element. We can see that it was receiving 20 pixels of bottom padding. So if we remove that, we can see that the spacing is gone, but now there appears to be double thick borders where the buttons touch the existing borderline. So to remedy that, we can simply remove the bottom border of our links. So here we are selecting the link elements. We've already added a border. We can just add a new property, border bottom, none. If we refresh, we can see that the links now sit flush on this full borderline. Finally, let's add a hover effect so that when the user hovers over a particular link, it changes its style. So to do that, we'll create a new rule. Site nav A hover. This is known as a pseudo selector. We are targeting the A element, but unlike this rule, we are adding a pseudo selector of hover. So now we can include styles in this rule. We can say background color, use that subtle green. So now, if we save and refresh and hover over a link, we can see that it lights up. And that will bring this lesson to a close. Just to show how powerful CSS is, really quickly, let's remove all of the CSS that we wrote in this lesson, and then I'll add it back in. But without it, we were dealing with a simple bulleted list. And with just a little bit of CSS, we were able to transform it into this. I hope this encourages you to believe that with CSS we can create any layout we imagine. I will see you in the next lesson.